Hello everyone. This is part of a series of programs that we're making looking at banks, markets and the environment. Disclosure is a core theme for environmentalists when it comes to the way that markets have worked, or rather the ways that markets can be prevented from failing. Crucially, there is a regulatory response. There are things people are trying to do to make sure that markets allocate resources better than they've done in the past. They have failed, there's no doubt about that. But how to stop that failure in future is crucial. And one of the core policy themes that come out of discussions that many people have had is the arrival of the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate and Financial Disclosure. And within that context, having companies disclose their primary, secondary and tertiary carbon footprints seems an extremely important way to try to get markets to realize when they're allocating resources in a negative way for the environment and try to steer them towards allocating resources in a positive way for the environment. And I'm really excited actually that I have someone whose intellect is clear to many who've read his books or followed him on social media, Professor Rupert Read. And Rupert's CV is fairly generous, but I want him to tell you about himself. So Rupert, if you could please introduce yourself, that would be great.
Well, thanks, Chidi. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, so I teach at the University of East Anglia. I teach philosophy, work alongside some of the world's leading climate scientists. And I've done a lot of other stuff as well. I founded a think tank called Greenhouse. Most recent book from them is Facing Up to Climate Reality, which has been very important for me. And I've worked now for a couple of years with Extinction Rebellion as a spokesperson, a political strategist and political liaison. I've also been active in the Green Party, various other stuff. And in special relation to what we're going to be talking about here today, some viewers will be interested in my work with Nassim Taleb on the precautionary principle and related stuff, which obviously is relevant to finance, but also relevant to the ecosystem. And here, of course, we're going to be talking about both.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that. Nassim Taleb, for those who don't know, is an American econometrician and a politician. Is he at NYU?
Yeah, kind of, but he mostly does his own thing now, and he's probably best known still for his book The Black Swan.
Absolutely.
And for the, I'll tell you a little story about Nassim. So when he came to give a talk at UEA some years ago, which I invited him to, at the end of the evening I offered him travel expenses, you know, as a visiting speaker. He said, look, I'm not going to trouble you for travel expenses. I bet against the banks in the financial crisis, and now I don't need to ask anyone for travel expenses.
I think the technical term is kurtosis. He talked about how there were fat tails at the ends of normal distributions that meant that all the extreme actions that we see in markets were actually a lot more common than were predicted by some of the models that the banks used. Within the context of the work that he did and the lecture that he had with you, are there any interesting anecdotes that you wanted to share about the impact that reading Black Swan's his book, working with him when he visited your university, and trying to understand the way markets work? What kind of observations have you had that have come out of that you think you can share with the audience that adds value?
Gosh, well, it's always been a very interesting experience working with Nassim. He's an extreme character. But really, the thing which is most important to me about him is simply his intellect, which is scintillating. And what he and I and others have tried to do is to get people to understand that we really need to take precautionary thinking so much more seriously. And I think there's been a huge education for people around the world in that this year with the tragedy of the coronavirus crisis, which would have been much less of a tragedy if precautionary thinking had been followed across the world. In the places where it was followed, places like New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea, there's been very, very little death. In the places where it wasn't followed, in the places where governments were reckless, in the places where they tried to, quote, keep the economy open, unquote, places like Brazil, the USA, and of course the United Kingdom, we've seen an absolute tsunami of death and morbidity and mortality. So Nassim started warning about this already in January. I started warning about it in February. I was speaking to the government behind the scenes saying, for God's sake, you've got to take this seriously. There is an enormous potential. We don't know how bad it's going to be. That's the whole point. Enormous potential exposure here to risk, to death, to long-term negative health conditions. I know a couple of young men who have got so-called long COVID, and believe you me, it's not pretty. So I think the world understands now the precautionary principle in practice a lot better than it did several months ago. That same logic needs to be carried through to the climate crisis and the broader ecological crisis. And that's been what so much of my work has been about in recent years. And in effect, that's what Extinction Rebellion is also trying to make happen. And it's what needs to happen in terms of the financial side of nature and climate as well.
Well, I think those are really important observations, Rupert. Thank you for sharing that. I think that the coincidence of bad risk management in dealing with a global pandemic shows an approach to governance, an approach to policy, and perhaps even an approach to government that is suboptimal. It's not good when you have the ability to step in time and save lives for what is a clear potential set of risks that can be shown by scientists to have predictable impact, but still, because of a lack of focus, you allow the worst to happen before you react.
And that's basically what happened earlier this year, right, in the US and the UK. And the climate crisis is very like the coronavirus crisis, only it's on a much slower timescale, right? So with the corona, we were looking at a question of things developing over days and weeks. With climate, it's a question of years and decades. But the fundamental issues are the same. And the fundamental question of are you going to be far-sighted? Are you trying to take care of your population ahead of the threat? That same fundamental issue is present. And it's fascinating, isn't it? Fascinating and terrifying that the very same countries which are laggards on the climate crisis, Brazil, the USA, and yes, also the UK, are the very same countries which led the way in terms of deaths from corona.
Working through that, actually, and focusing and developing on your precautionary principle, which I think is a really important policy guideline to work around. In banking, and this is what Nassim actually wrote about in his book, Black Swans, many risk management departments work on a certain set of probabilities, and they work with a classic normal distribution. They work with assumptions about how the chances of certain extreme outcomes will vary under different market conditions. And very interestingly, there was an observation that was made in finance circles that if contemporary banks applied the same risk management that they do internally, externally, if they gave the climate and the second order effects of their own actions the same risk management treatment as they do their own financial treatment, they would be a lot more cautious about the kinds of business entities they supported, because ultimately, of course, this is going to have an impact on their business models. But within that context, of course, what's really important, and in recent months I've been involved in working with teams of people from different groups, including XR, Greenpeace, Erdegaard, working on entities like Barclays, who've in the past taken the exact opposite of a precautionary principle. They've leapt for whatever it was they thought was going to be profitable in the short term. They've worked without any kind of moral or long-term or sustainable regard for things. And currently, we're in a battle with them, trying to get them to actually comply with the TCFD in a workable way. I noticed you wrote an excellent article about that recently. Did you want to talk about that and talk about sort of what your position is on that and potential changes to the TCFD that you see in the future?
So as you mentioned, people talk about three scopes of the emissions that companies or whatever have responsibility for. Scope 1 is the direct emissions from a company. Scope 2 are the ones that are a result of their demands indirectly in terms of things like
the supply relationship.
Yeah, the supply relationship, the electricity they use, and so on and so forth. And Scope 3 is basically the large scale effects elsewhere in their customer chain and so forth. Richard Murphy, the most famous accountant in Britain, author of The Joy of Tax, has proposed Scope 4, which would be for the company's sort of retail effects of products that they buy and so on, to include those as well. So myself and Rox Sanford, we wrote an article in Reuters Breaking Views proposing 2 new scopes, Scope 5 and Scope 6. Scope 5 is basically the effect of companies lobbying, and Scope 6 is the effect of their brand power. And right now, Scope 5 and Scope 6 will, in the case of most companies, be hugely worsening, in effect, their carbon emission responsibility, because most companies lobby to have regulations reduced, etc., and most companies' brand power tries to encourage customers to buy more of stuff that they don't need, and so on and so forth. The suggestion we make towards the end of that article, quite a hopeful suggestion, is, well, what if that was turned around? What if you've got companies that actually started to lobby for tougher regulations on them, or for precautionary type considerations to be brought in? Or what if you've got companies whose brand identity was all about reducing the amount of wasteful rubbish that customers bought, etc.? Then companies with their Scope 5 and Scope 6 emissions, they could be reducing their emissions rather than
if they had negative
increasing.
Scope 5
Yeah,
or
exactly,
negative 6,
exactly. Yeah. What I would love to see would be those kind of ideas, Scopes 5 and Scope 6, lobbying power and brand power, being picked up, and thereby penalising those companies whose the effects of their lobbying and the effects of their branding is to make the situation in the world worse, and benefiting those companies where those things were moving in the right kind of direction. I think that would be an enormously hopeful development. But I would like to go further than that, Chidi, because it seems to me that we need to also acknowledge that, and I think you're in agreement with this, that TCFD, all it is really is a kind of useful first step, even if it does get kind of expanded in this kind of way. Because it's an illusion to think that disclosure alone, important though it is, and I'm with Extinction Rebellion, number 1 demand, tell the truth. Important though it is, there is a real limit on the actual effect that disclosure can have. It's a fantasy to think that if companies and governments and customers and so on all just know, if they have information about what's happening, that they're going to correct all the so-called market failures that result from it. They won't do that unless there are hard incentives in place for them to do it, and regulations and ethics. So we need to be going way beyond the kind of thinking that is embedded in TCFD. The first step, which would be natural to make beyond the current TCFD framework, even if it was improved, would be the kind of thing that Richard Murphy recommends, namely that we include climate risk in the numbers, in companies' accounts, in a meaningful way, on the balance sheets. Even that, though, in my opinion, would not be enough, because in order to do that in a sufficiently meaningful and precautionary way, you would have to go beyond what is actually provably the effects of companies' behavior and how that can be measured in their accounts. What I would really like to see is a thoroughly precautionary and thoroughly ethical approach. Now, this is really dreaming now, where we don't just have the scopes including lobbying power and brand power. We don't just include stuff in the company's balance sheets, which I think we really do need to try to do, but we systematically go beyond that to say, how do we actually protect ourselves? How do we protect our company? How do we protect our stakeholders? How do we protect our children? How do we protect nature in the most proactive and precautionary and ethical way, and that would go beyond anything that Richard Murphy is proposing, into the kind of dimension of things such as, well, obviously the precautionary principle itself, also ideas like the law of ecocide, and the kinds of ways that you would reorient the behavior of companies and of entire societies if you were trying to be in a situation where you didn't just end up getting done over by the law of ecocide, but you were making sure that you didn't do any ecocide in the first place. So I hope I haven't painted too broad a canvas there, but that's really where I would like us to be heading. For me, TCFD, even if expanded as it should be, is only a very preliminary step. We need to also get the numbers around climate risk and much more difficult risks around natural capital, ecosystems, habitat onto balance sheets. And just because it's fundamentally impossible to fully represent adequately in numbers alone the kind of threats that we're facing, because it's an obscenity to actually put a price in balance sheets on human life, on the value of a species or an irreplaceable ecosystem. What I would really like to see us doing, if we're allowed to dream big, is to have qualitative, precautionary and ethical and ecological considerations being the basis of the way that companies and governments think about what they ought to be doing, and on the basis of the fundamental laws and regulations by which they operate, and not expect those things to be fully internalized in a supposedly perfectly running market, which will never exist.
That's amazing, because you've managed to contextualize the TCFD in a way that is actually quite accessible if you think about it in the way that you've spelled it out. Scope 4, 5 and 6 though are really interesting, because they add a lot more color about the brand influence that happens when these businesses employ communication professionals to try to extend the understanding of the business that they bring to their customers. There's also the issue of active lobbying towards policy, which is frequently left off a lot of accounting and reporting documentation, but both of those have a huge historic impact on a business. You sort of think of all the intangible assets the business has built up over time and the influence they have. But for me, crucially, scopes 4, 5 and 6 are incredibly important, because they also, unlike scopes 1 to 3, have a forward-looking element as well. You know, you can see what direction the business wants to go in by what policy it wants to support. And as you said very eloquently earlier on, if those are environmentally positive, they could effectively have a negative carbon footprint. So help the business to reduce its impact when looked at in the round. And that's incredibly important, because of course a theme of this program is disclosure. It's about trying to get as wide a palette of information out so that everybody understands the consequences of their behavior, the impact of their behavior, and policymakers understand how to make the world a better place for absolutely everyone. But within the context of disclosure, I wanted to talk about a whole bunch of other things, including some themes you have in your book, because in the past I've talked about how one of the reasons why markets fail so epically is the information asymmetries that build up over time. In other words, the fact that we just don't know enough about what businesses are doing, and they concurrently may not know enough about either their suppliers or their partners, or even, as you mentioned, their lobbyists. They may not even know that. So disclosure is important, but you were very keen to point out that all of these things only provide us with a palette of information from which we then make the really substantive discussions and really substantive decisions that go with those discussions. Within the context of following through from the key theme of this program, which is disclosure, I noticed you've written a book which has a plethora of different elements of disclosure to it. I wanted to explore that in a bit more detail with you. Is that all right?
Absolutely. Well, the book is called Extinction Rebellion: Insights from the Inside. So firstly, it's about a bit of truth-telling about Extinction Rebellion, but perhaps more importantly, there's a thread running through the book of the importance of the first demand of Extinction Rebellion, to tell the truth. And some of that relates directly to what we've been talking about. So there's a chapter on what should be Extinction Rebellion's targets, you know, looking at maybe finance, maybe oil companies, etc. There's a chapter called The Billionaire Rebellion, about my experiences in the belly of the beast in Davos, where I went for XR early this year. And there's a chapter asking, which was actually originally another piece that was published in Reuters with Breaking Views, asking whether there could be a positive relationship between Extinction Rebellion and big finance, in as much as, well, on the one hand, Extinction Rebellion is trying to save the world, which is in everyone's interest, but somewhat more specifically, those who want to do the right thing in the financial world, the Mark Carneys of this world and so on, Mark Carney behind the TCFD, who are trying to move things in the right direction, arguably the best ally they have in terms of breaking open the window of what's possible further is Extinction Rebellion. And that's so often been my experience when I've had a chance to talk to politicians or business people or financiers, etc., typically in private over the last 18 months. They so often say, keep doing what you're doing because you're making it possible for stuff to happen that wasn't possible before. And yeah, in terms of this crucial point about the power of lobbying, what we so desperately need to do is to move from a world where companies are benefiting from their past experiences of lobbying, benefiting maybe from some degree of what's called regulatory capture that they've achieved, where they've really kind of got the regulators by the short and curlies or whatever. We need to move from that to a situation where companies and others are actually moving things in the right direction rather than in the wrong direction. Now that might sound like a very idealistic or utopian view, but it seems to me that's one of the few hopes we have of actually changing stuff quickly enough to prevent catastrophic climate breakdown, which is another of the key themes of this book. In a way, this book tells a very happy and inspiring story, which is the story of Extinction Rebellion and the success we've had in moving the dial and changing public opinion and broader opinion and elite opinion on what's possible and what's necessary vis-a-vis climate and ecological breakdown. In another way, it tells a kind of sad story because the story is of how that opinion has been changing, but nevertheless virtually nothing has actually changed. Virtually nothing's been done, and how what we're able to hope for now 2 years later is perhaps rather less than we were able to hope for 2 years ago, because those 2 years have passed and time is so very short.
Well, that's an extremely valuable set of comments. And just to work through all of them, the idea that the banking industry might want to resist disclosure, but in the end comes to realize that disclosure is actually in its own self-interest. So when we argue about the TCFD, when we demonstrate saying banks, tell the truth about what's going on, it may at first blush appear that we're putting on so much pressure on these overworked banks to get involved in red tape, but actually the opposite is the case, because with disclosure, you allow companies to actually allocate capital better, in a more optimal way, in a more sustainable way. I think a good example of this is the insurance industry. So if you think about yourself as being a financial institution where many of the decisions you're making, many of the clients that you're serving are exposed to client risk in and of themselves, an environment, a business environment with more disclosure is better for your business, because you can help both yourself and your clients manage risks a lot better. Did you explore that?
No, I didn't, but I nearly did. It's something I've written about. The reason it didn't quite get into the book was because the coronavirus crisis intervened. But I strongly believe that you're right, Chidi, that insurance is an obvious target for Extinction Rebellion, that insurance is an absolutely vital potential lever for change in terms of the financial markets, that insurance, virtually above all other sectors, is the sector where there should be a precautionary approach being followed, because insurers are the ones who are going to be carrying the can if, as seems very likely, things deteriorate in the coming years in ways that go along with and in some cases exceed expectations, models, what is firmly evidenced. Going back to what we were saying before, disclosure is vital. Beyond that, you have to put what we know into the numbers in order to judge what's happening, and so people can correctly evaluate what a company is really worth and so on. And if you actually put the climate risk, which is provable, into the numbers, then suddenly the balance sheets of companies like BP look far worse even than they've now admitted, having downgraded their value and so on recently. And then going beyond that, as I said earlier, you need to actually get serious about being precautious, about justice, about ethics. And if you try to take that seriously, then you're actually getting into the kind of place that the insurance companies need to be in, because when insurance companies are exposed to risks which are of an uncertain dimension and could be so great that they will, break the bank at Monte Carlo, break the back of the reinsurers, etc. That's a terrible situation for them to be in. And insurance is such a kind of totemic aspect of our system, because insurance is supposed to be about making us safe. Right? And what the climate crisis is all about, just as in a smaller way the coronavirus crisis has been about, is our vulnerability, is our unsafety. There's a limit to the extent which we can make ourselves safe as we move into a world which is more and more inherently unpredictable and inherently unsafe. And that is the world that we are creating. That is the world that we're creating by letting the climate and ecological emergency let rip. So insurers ought to be the ones who see this and move to protect their customers and to protect themselves, and thereby, of course, to protect their world. So I would love to talk more about this. I want to publish on it in the future. More importantly, I want to get us campaigning on this. I think that better than small retail, as it were, banking and other useful, interesting targets for change in the financial sector. Better than any of those, I would argue, potentially, is the insurance sector as an absolutely totemic sector for everything we're talking about.
There's one other theme within the context of banks, disclosure, and insurance companies, so finance in general, that falls out of that actually, which is that last month, for the first time in its history, Lloyd's of London admitted its involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, it did so by admitting that some of its names had participated in the slave trade by sort of insuring ships that were involved in that trade.
Yep.
We know that trade was obviously a human rights catastrophe, but it was also an ecocidal catastrophe. It changed the landscapes of at least 2 continents and changed the course of man's carbon footprint on this planet. So within something as gigantic as that, Lloyd's apology sits very heavily on everyone's shoulders. People are trying to think about constructive ways in which entities like Lloyd's or banks like Barclays or anybody else who would like to correct the very grave errors of their business past. And in terms of constructing that, in terms of thinking about that, are there any insights you could share with us?
Well, I guess one obvious thing to say is there's a potential case there for reparations. I think possibly an even more important thing to say is if we look at the long-term legacy of the slave trade, we can see its destructive effects in countries like the US. We can see much more starkly its destructive effects in some African countries and some Caribbean countries. And if we were to say, what's the most important thing now to do with regard to those countries? Well, I think that would take us back to what we were saying a couple of minutes ago. Namely, it's typically those countries which are, again, the most exposed to the risks around climate and ecological breakdown. So I think a really sort of constructive way forward for an organisation like Lloyd's would be to say, mea culpa, we've got this dirty past. Part of what we'd like to do now to sort of try, insofar as it's possible, to somehow kind of balance the scales or go beyond just putting the record straight in terms of making an apology or something, words can be cheap, is to actually put money and resources behind protecting those countries, a country like Haiti, for example, which is so horrendously vulnerable to the vicissitudes of our deteriorating global climate. To put to put those matters right. And insurers could do this by fairly marking risk and by ensuring that the way that they are currently operating to help and protect, for example, oil companies and other companies which are having an ongoing negative effect on the prospects of a country like Haiti or a country like Liberia, to ensure that gets turned around, right? If insurers were to get serious about pressurizing government to create a situation where they, as insurance companies, were less likely to go bankrupt, if insurers like Lloyd's were to stop insuring coal companies and fracking companies and start looking, say, to offer more preferential terms to companies that would be, or countries that would be turning things in a better direction. That's the kind of, game-changing, visionary behaviour which is needed now in the desperate situation in which we find ourselves.
It certainly pulls us back to the issue of disclosure in a really positive and action-orientated way. Because we start off saying it's really important to get companies who sit at this nexus of economic activity, these banks, these insurance companies who facilitate these markets. It's really important to get them to disclose what it is they're facilitating.
Yep.
And not just their own footprint, but their suppliers' footprints and their partners' footprints.
Absolutely.
So we start off with that as sort of our opening thesis. The next thing we say is, what policy should come out of it? What should be done? We know that it's really important to set out a polluter pays principle as an overarching theme. We know that using a precautionary principle in terms of the pace with which we act is super important.
Yep.
And we know there are specific laws, like the international law against ecocide, that ought to be supported. But I think a really important positive message that comes out of what you said and this discussion is that within the context of trying to understand how entities like Lloyd's, who have been forthright enough to lead the industry in the direction of admitting to its past mistakes and talking about ways of being constructive, this palette allows us to say, well, one of the really important ways of being constructive is to look at regenerative, reparative means of acting. So investing in reforestation in places where whole forests have been lost, investing in ecocide repair and prevention where these kinds of things have happened, and then reparations to reestablish communities, to reestablish cultures, and to help people live in a sustainable way. And I was really actually quite happy about the idea that it makes sense to charge more money to companies that are ecocidal or climate damaging or have big carbon footprints, and simply charge less money to companies that have smaller carbon footprints, that are eco-regenerative, that help and that are more sustainable. I think we come to this point where we've now come full circle, right? We've gone from, actually let's talk about disclosure, and then we say, this is what you show. But then we come all the way back to saying, what is disclosure for? What does it get us? And what it gets us is equity. It gets us good, sustainable business. It's in banks and insurance companies' own self-interest to have.
Well, let's say that's what it could get us, right? Again, I don't want to overstate how much disclosure alone can do. I think we need to see disclosure as a step towards more ethical behavior, as a way in which it becomes more difficult for companies or others to go on with unethical behavior. And then on the back of that, we need to put in place firm incentive structures. We need to revolutionize the way that accounts are written, not just qualitatively, but quantitatively. And then, as I said earlier, going beyond that still, we need to think about how countries and the world system could be run in a more fundamentally precautionary and ethical way, which stayed ahead of the numbers and stayed ahead of the evidence and stayed ahead indeed of disclosures, at least about disclosures about what's proven and what's been done in the past and so on and so forth. We need to be looking forward. We need to be horizon scanning. We need to be aware of the risk, even of events which are not probable, but if they have a sufficiently ruinous potential downside. That's what sort of the precautionary principle is about. So that's the sort of three-stage kind of maneuver that I keep on seeing or suggesting. Disclosure first, then getting stuff in the hard numbers that economists understand and that hard-nosed business people understand, and then going beyond that to try to create a truly precautionary, ethical regime which is not restricted to the evidence, not restricted to what is provable, not restricted to what can be strictly accounted for. And by the way, that's even more important when it comes to ecosystems, which are a lot less measurable than carbon.
Those are excellent points. I think to wrap this around what we've already said, you mentioned Nassim Taleb's Black Swan book, which is a model showing that standard deviations out of normal distribution are not as uniform as people expected them to be. They vary quite a lot. So you have this thing called fat tails, carthosis, which means that the extremes are actually a lot more likely to happen than a standard model assumes it's going to be.
Absolutely.
Well, something really interesting within that has happened, which is that the Bank of International Settlements, which sets out capital adequacy requirements of banks and insurance companies around the world, has come up with a new theme for conferences they're having this year, and they're talking about green swans.
Yes.
They're talking about the fact that these risks that are being assumed by financial institutions about the consistency of our current biosphere or the consistency of our current climate regime may not be a valid set of assumptions to make going forward. There may need to be a lot more precautionary rules brought in that change the way that banks behave, because if the green swans are underestimated, we stand a very good chance of not even having workable business models for some of these banks.
And my argument would be that virtually always the green swans are being systematically underestimated, and that we've designed a world economy to operate on a certain kind of paradigm of efficiency, which is a terrible paradigm. It doesn't leave us margins. If you were a neoliberal economist and you were designing the human body, there is no way you'd let us have 2 kidneys. You'd say that's ridiculously inefficient, right? So, and that's what they're doing. They're allowing everything which is not absolutely essential to be stripped away, and that makes you incredibly, incredibly vulnerable. We ought to move in the opposite direction, and to start with the sort of financial basics, that would mean that insurance companies and everything else would have to be operating with much more kind of margins, with much stronger, much larger contingencies. And by God, the likelihood is that they're going to need them in the times that are coming. And of course, if they don't have them, we know what happens as well. They go bankrupt and then they appeal to the government to bail them out. Well, sooner or later, those kind of bailouts are not going to be possible. You can't bail out ecosystems. You can't bail out the whole planet. There needs to be a fundamental change of attitude. Is it likely? No, it's very unlikely to happen. That's why we're probably headed for a collapse. But it's possible, and the more we move in the direction of it, the less heavy the blow is going to be. The more time we're going to be buying ourselves to make changes, to adapt, to get more people to wake up, the more chance we've got.
Those are, again, very, very important statements, because we've worked within the paradigm of the past sort of 10, 20 years of what Naomi Klein would call disaster capitalism, sort of shifting from war to war and sort of from scarcity to need for knee-jerk policy, to what appears to be now in the sort of post-COVID era to emergency capitalism. So not so much disaster capitalism, but now we're in a situation where, given that we're in a climate and ecological emergency, we need to make new economic rules that involve a precautionary principle, that involve a polluter pays principle, that involve new laws that stop people from damaging the only planet that we have, and that move us to a place where economics has to be sustainable within the context of managed risks. And what that means for companies is, first of all, disclosure, as we've talked about, but then the second order set of actions, the understanding of the implications, and a real intent, like you have to have the intention to make a difference. That's where we are, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And in terms of what this means in terms of politics, countries like the US and the UK under their current governments are very ill-placed to take any of this seriously. I guess one of my hopes is that as there is an increasing waking up to and bitterness about the way in which the Trump and Johnson administrations have caused mass death to their populations through the coronavirus pandemic, this will be seen as the thin end of a coming very large wedge, because let's be clear, the coronavirus pandemic is itself a product of the ecological emergency, itself a product of habitat destruction, of animal cruelty, and most crucially of super spreading around the world by jet planes, by our absurd system of air travel and hypermobility. Those populist governments need to be discredited vis-a-vis their coronavirus pandemic failure, and then that should carry over into the understanding that we need a fundamentally new way of doing economics, which builds in ecology in the ways that we've been talking about. If that kind of realization occurs, then there is some real hope, and it has to happen now. A crucial theme in my book, towards the end of my book, is that this is the last opportunity probably that we have to make this kind of reset, because these reset opportunities don't come along very often. The last one was probably 2008 with the financial crisis. That's over a decade ago. We don't have over a decade in which to get this sorted. We know that this is the decade in which we have to get the climate and the ecosystem around the world sorted. If we don't, that is game over. That's very clear from the science. So it has to be now. The money that is being spent now, the magic money tree that's been found this year, this is a one-off opportunity. It will not be here in a few years' time when there'll be calls for belt tightening, etc. So if we don't get the reset right now, it's never going to happen. It is a very real occasion for the classic catchphrase, now or never. And I know that people are often tempted to say this and are sometimes accused of crying wolf, but I'm not crying wolf. I'm crying, there is a wolf, because there is a wolf. And the wolf is the climate and ecological emergency. This is our last chance to sort it out.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Thank you very much, Professor Read.
Thanks.